But now I want to turn our attention to the keynote speaker and provide that introduction briefly as well. James Hughes is the Associate Provost for Institutional Research at UMass Boston and the Executive Director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. He's a bioethicist and a sociologist with a doctorate in sociology from the University of Chicago, where he taught bioethics at the McLean Center. He's also taught health policy, bioethics, medical sociology, research methods, and so much more at multiple institutions. So he's made not only significant contributions to teaching, but also in scholarship and bioethics research. If you've not read his book, Citizen Cyborg, rereading it in advance of today's conference led me to believe that it's really as applicable today as it was when it was first published. That book connects novel biotechnologies to not just research science, which many of us, of course, care about, but also to fundamental democratic ideals, which that seems more important now, perhaps, than ever. Those of you who have participated in prior of our annual research ethics conferences know that our tradition is to start with a keynote. It offers a big picture, sometimes provocative thoughts and questions for discussion, and I've seen a sneak peek of Dr. Hughes' presentation. I think that's exactly what it will be. So please help me in welcoming James Hughes.
Thank you so much for having me today, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot about this topic. As a technology ethicist, I address myriad topics, so this is not one that I am as deep in as I would like to be, but hopefully I can learn more today. Let's see. I'm wired. I definitely wear devices. I'll show you a full panoply of what I wear. And as a consequence of my own passion for my own self-quantification, I'm a statistician by daily occupation, and so I've always had an interest in self-quantification. I have gotten interested in the topic of where it's heading for us in society, and I think it's fair to say that over the last couple of decades, healthcare has been quietly shifting from hospitals to bodies. Once the goal was to build smarter hospitals, now it's to make our bodies the hospital. And I think this, and I will lay out some reasons why I think the shift is both political and economic. But it was a realization I had while I was writing my dissertation, which I'll discuss in a second, that the inpatient bed is what used to be a profit center for hospitals. And then for integrated health systems, they began to realize that the inpatient bed was actually a cost center, and that as much as possible, its use should be minimized. And the continuously monitored patient is a data generating asset, as well as someone who could be treated more cheaply outside of a hospital context. Wearables integrated into healthcare promise better outcomes and early detection, but also invite a new regime of digital surveillance in which not just medical, but also workplace and police authorities measure compliance with sensors. The question is not whether we should wear these devices, I think, but who owns the data, who profits from it, and how we preserve autonomy when surveillance moves from our wrist to the clinic and the cloud. So I do a podcast, by the way, called Prosthetic Gods with my colleague. And almost every topic that we discuss has to start with, okay, Nir, is this really a new thing, or is this just an old thing that has been repackaged as a new thing? In the case of self-tracking, it's an old thing. Long before we strap sensors to our wrists, people have been counting and recording themselves. In pre-modern households and monasteries, keeping track of work, prayer, and food was both a moral and economic discipline. Puritan diarists recorded sins and prayers, not out of narcissism, but to monitor the soul's fluctuations, to audit virtue as if it were an account. Ben Franklin's daily self-assessment against his chart of 13 virtues turned moral striving into a spreadsheet. With the spread of pocket watches in the 16th century, time became measurable, ordering urban and industrial life. Darwin kept meticulous logs of his health, moods, and productivity, down to the number of pages and letters that he had written. The diary, the watch, and the ledger made the self visible as a sequence of data points. Each technology allowed new forms of self-improvement and new ways for employers and the state to measure us. The quantified self began as a moral self under surveillance, first by God, then by the self, and then by society. The goal remains to turn life into something that we can count and compare and improve. For most of the 20th century, That could have been more visible. For most of the 20th century, modern medicine organized around the hospital. My doctoral thesis, as I said, was on the division of labor between nurses and doctors in hospitals. I was looking at whether managed care and nascent artificial intelligence would encourage the moving of responsibility from doctors to nurses. While writing that thesis as healthcare consolidation proceeded in the 90s, I came to a critical realization. Hospitals have a lot of fixed costs necessary for urgent care and surgery, but too expensive for long observational and post-surgical stays. New mothers could spend 5 days in a 5-star hotel for the price of post-delivery observation. Hospitals are really only profitable for hospitals and people who work for them and the firms that make things for them. For healthcare as a whole, hospitals are cost centers. They absorb nearly 1/3 of our total health spending, and since 2000, inpatient admissions and bed days have dropped by 1/5, while the surgical gaze has migrated outward. And that's what that chart shows, the inpatient days and the number of admissions declining over the last 25 years. Wearables and remote sensors promise the holy grail of medicine: faster, cheaper, better outcomes. They detect arrhythmias before strokes, they coach breathing before panic attacks, and warn of relapse before the ambulance is called. For payers and policymakers, the incentive is irresistible: reduce visits, prevent readmissions, and keep the person well enough to stay at home. Those who must be admitted should be stepped down and discharged into home care as soon as possible. Hospitals and clinics burdened by fixed costs, buildings, specialists, equipment that must remain full to stay solvent, MRI machines that need to be used to get paid for. Integrated systems, whether Kaiser Permanente or Britain's National Health Service, seek to align payer and provider incentives under one balance sheet, keep patients healthy outside of high-cost settings, and the savings stay in-house. Of course, countries with universal healthcare systems have much stronger incentives to undertake difficult measures that may not be profitable in the short run, but that improve public health. Such systems usually invest more in public health, prevention, and community nursing than we do. But the growing power of Medicare and the concentration of ownership in insurers, hospitals, and auxiliary services also encourage a systemic understanding of at least the costs of healthcare. Since 2001, Medicare has reimbursed limited telehealth services and dramatically expanded its use during the COVID-19 emergency. Over 68% of Medicare certified home health agencies now use some form of telemonitoring or virtual care. The results have been mixed but promising. The 2024 evaluation of the Hospital Without Walls program, which was approved in 2021, which was specifically for acute-based services, so intravenous services and things like that, found that home-based acute care costs reduced costs by 20% and reduced mortality. Now, ironically, admissions increased because some conditions were detectable by home telemetry or home monitoring that required readmission. And so some admissions actually increased in this program, but otherwise reduced cost and reduced mortality. A recent survey of over 1,000 clinicians estimated that shifting more services to the home could save approximately $100 billion a year. But of course, these estimates are off the top of our head, but still. Okay, the hospital at home model. Beyond post-discharge and chronic care management, the acute hospital at home care model launched during the pandemic allowed Medicare and Medicaid patients to receive full inpatient level care without leaving their homes. Intravenous therapy, oxygen and respiratory management, vital sign monitoring, diagnostic tests, social workers, meal services, everything else. By late 2025, more than 400 hospitals had joined the experiment. The outcomes were striking: equal or better recovery rates, reduced complications, and significant savings. Patients overwhelmingly preferred the safety and familiarity of home to the alienation of the ward. Yet, as emergency orders expired, so too did the program's legal authority. And Congress has not extended the program. We'll see now that they're back in session if they take it up. But in October, hospitals were told to wind it down, which is tragic. In the meantime, technologies for self-improvement, self-measurement, continue to expand, becoming newer and cheaper and more accurate for consumers and healthcare. Scales and cuffs, oximeters, and ECG patches, once the province of nurses, are now streaming data directly to dashboards and cloud records. Half of Americans have owned and used some kind of wearable device: continuous glucose monitors, smartwatches, fall detectors, wearable blood pressure cuffs, and so forth. and about 20% are using them right now. The Food and Drug Administration classifies these devices along a continuum of risk from simple class 1 devices that need only to be registered with them to class 2 devices that must be cleared and class 3 implantables in critical care technologies that require pre-market approval. This taxonomy captures the fluid boundary between wellness and treatment, lifestyle, gadget, and life support, and that boundary is dissolving. Some devices merely inform, but others intervene. A Fitbit can be marketed as a toy for self-improvement, but a faulty glucose monitor can be deadly. For all the hype, and I think one of the critical complaints and kind of dystopian anxieties people have about wearables is the idea that this is a kind of self-measurement alienates us from organic oneness with our body. And I just find this difficult to accept for this reason. For all the hype, the evidence for consumer self-quantification is cautiously optimistic, not revolutionary. Fewer than half of those who try one use it for more than a year, and its impact on behavior varies widely. Some studies found as much as 75% attrition in their use within 100 days. For those who do persist in their use, however, meta-analyses confirm modest, measurable benefits. A 2024 review of randomized trials that use smartwatch interventions found that they improved emotion regulation, reduced hospital admissions, enhanced medication adherence, and benefited many conditions from diabetic foot ulcers to atrial fibrillation detection. Another synthesis of nearly 400 mobile health studies reported with smartwatches reported positive effects on blood pressure, glucose control, cholesterol levels, anxiety, and patient satisfaction. Still, after a year or two, most users stop using their devices, citing inconvenience or loss of motivation. The feedback loops of data and reward become background noise. So I find it hard to believe that we're all alienating ourselves with the use of these tools when they're so easy to ignore and give up. When wearable data is shared with others, however, outcomes improve and benefits persist. Just knowing that family or friends will see the data or receiving reminders and reviews from clinicians sustains engagement. The moral seems clear. Self-quantification works best when it is social, when the cyborg remains connected not only to the cloud, but to the supportive community of care. The data alone are inert and require social support. It's too early to tell, but it is possible that chatbot coaches could provide the same social benefits. If agentic support does facilitate self-tracking change, we would likely feel much more comfortable sharing our health and the details of our lives with a personal digital coach. And I'll discuss that in a moment. But many others would like us to share our data, starting with our bosses. The workplace was the original laboratory for the cyborg imagination. Since the 19th century, bosses have sought to measure every action of workers to maximize productivity. And once we started holding them accountable for workplace injuries, workplace measurement began tracking dangerous conditions as well. The term cyborg was actually coined in 1960 in a NASA proposal envisioning astronauts whose vital signs could be continuously monitored and whose behavior could, if necessary, be pharmacologically adjusted from Earth if they started to lose it. Control, we have a problem. He seems to be losing it. He needs some antipsychotic medication shoved in his neck. Today, wearables on factory floors and delivery routes turn delivery drivers, warehouse workers, and gig workers into cyborgs. Firefighters, apparently, as well. Smart helmets track fatigue and heat exposure. Wristbands detect falls or hazardous air. Wellness trackers encourage steps, mindfulness, and punctual sleep. For employers, these tools promise safety, productivity, and engagement. Performance analytics merge with health surveillance. In theory, such monitoring could protect laborers from overwork or heat stroke. And in practice, it provides firms with information on how far they can push workers. The wired workplace thus completes a circuit first imagined in the space race, humans as telemetry. Employers and their insurers increasingly monitor patient compliance through health screenings and treatments. Some employers want to use mobile health data collected by employees, both on and off the job, for many purposes. American law offers partial guide rails. HIPAA protects the privacy of medical data. Americans with Disabilities Act and Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act restrict coercive data collection. The Federal Trade Commission can punish misuse of non-HIPAA covered health data. All of these federal agencies, of course, require the willingness of federal agencies to do their job and their capacity to do their job, which I'll get to in a second. To preserve data anonymity, companies typically hire third-party administrators who return only aggregate and de-identified results. But who decides when sharing is voluntary? Should participation in biometric tracking ever be a condition of employment or insurance, even if the evidence suggests fewer workplace accidents or better health outcomes? US law currently draws a fragile boundary between encouragement and coercion. Employers may sponsor wellness programs only if participation is truly voluntary, but participation can be linked to lower premiums or wellness bonuses. And voluntariness evaporates when incentives become penalties, when declining a smartwatch means forfeiting a bonus or paying a surcharge. John Hancock's Vitality life insurance program ties rewards to daily step counts and heart rate data. Employers run voluntary fitness challenges, and if you opt out, it could quietly affect your advancement. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has ruled that even modest premium differentials can render a program coercive. So continuous behavior surveillance marks a qualitative shift from an annual exam, which is considered acceptable, to 24/7 panopticon. The ethical test is whether workers and patients can say no without consequence. Freedom to measure ourselves means little if the unmeasured are punished. The authority of medicine is being redistributed from physicians to patients and now to algorithms. Mobile health technologies promise continuous oversight, but also raise a delicate question. What should an algorithm do when a patient refuses its advice? Non-compliance is not new. Patients have always fibbed about pills or exercise or diets. What is new is the escalation ladder, now built into digital care. Reminders for clients, notifications for caregivers, automated alerts for clinicians. Systems must distinguish between forgetfulness and autonomy, between a lapse and a considered refusal. Everyone agrees that humans must remain in the loop, but home care algorithms need to specify when and how to involve them. Many blind comparisons of provider and chatbot communications with patients confirm that patients often prefer clinical chatbots, which seem more attentive and competent than the average harried clinician. Compliance improves when the simulated nurse offers empathy rather than issuing orders. We may resist prompts, achievement badges, and gamification in an employee wellness program, but embrace them from a digital friend. And the risk is that parasocial trust then becomes algorithmic deference. We obey the machine because it feels impartial, tireless, omniscient, and kind. That trust may yield better outcomes, even if it is precipitous and unwarranted by science. The promise of wearables then hides their fragility. One night last September, my phone erupted an alarm. My blood sugar, it claimed, had spiked from 120 to 280 in a matter of an hour. I took extra metformin, paced the house, trying to get it to go down, and then I remembered the half dozen failures I'd already had with these Dexcom continuous glucose monitors already, just putting them on and having them not work, which cost $50 a piece and only last for 10 days. It's the only piece of healthcare utilization I feel guilty about. But I figure since I write about this stuff, I have an excuse. But I took it off, put it back on. It turned out that that was the problem, and the crisis vanished. The problem was mechanical, not metabolic. If I took insulin, however, and I don't, but if I'd taken insulin and given myself an extra dose, I could have easily ended up hypoglycemic. I was not alone. Dexcom now faces a class action lawsuit over device failures, a federal investigation for securities fraud, and a recall order for defective sensors. Oversight of these tools falls to the FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health, which just laid off 3,500 staff amid political hostility to all regulation. And it's probably not a coincidence that one of the CDRH staffers that was fired was in charge of reviewing Elon Musk's Neuralink brain-computer interface implant, and that Musk was unhappy with the scrutiny of their animal trials. Every productive system carries the imprint of its training data, and all training data introduces biases that need to be monitored and tweaked. Sometimes using race as a clinical indicator is legitimate. Being African American does increase the risk of sickle cell anemia. But sometimes the correlation conceals injustice, as when an algorithm prioritizes white patients for advanced therapies because historically white recipients lived longer, ignoring the structural causes of such a disparity. In home care algorithms, bias can be subtler and more complex to detect. An Optum algorithm estimated that Black patients needed less home health care support since they had used those services less in the past. Even pulse oximeters, now ubiquitous in smartwatches, systemically underestimate oxygen saturation in darker skin tones, delaying care for Black hypoxic patients. Policy remedies for algorithmic bias are overdue. Europe has established a hub, the European Center for Algorithmic Transparency, to test for algorithmic bias. The US could use something similar, but first should rebuild the capacity of the CDRH and all other relevant regulatory agencies. Legislation should mandate audits for bias in all clinical algorithms, public transparency of data sets, and require clear appeal pathways for anyone denied home-based services by machine's judgment. So who controls the torrents of data that our wearables generate? In practice, the answer is really us. Users can sometimes download or delete their data, but the rights to portability and monetization, even more hypothetically, remain aspirational. Monetization would be your right to sell it to somebody, to make them buck off of it. We supply the raw material for these multi-billion-dollar health analytics markets. HIPAA protects information inside medical systems, but not in the consumer apps that mediate most of our self-tracking. The Federal Trade Commission has begun cracking down, fining GoodRx and BetterHelp for secretly sharing user health data with advertisers, but the problem is systemic. True privacy would mean not just consent boxes and data dashboards, but legal recognition that biometric data are extensions of ourself, subject to the same moral and property rights that we claim over our own thoughts and speech. We should be able to download our data and upload it to a new system, which would require adherence to federal data standards, new federal data standards, and design regulations. Now, looking ahead, we got all kinds of things coming down the pike. I was just reviewing the news, and I think MIT just published a paper on an injectable brain-computer interface, injectable in the arm. It migrates up to the head, to the brain, and I don't know, I haven't read the paper yet, but somehow it finds where it needs to go, implants itself, powers itself locally, and can deliver electrical stimulation to parts of the brain. And it's like, I thought that was 20 or 30 years away. Now it's just experimental at this point. We'll see how well it works. But we got a lot coming down the pike. EEG headsets now allow people with paralysis to control prosthetics, exoskeletons, and home devices solely through thought. EEG earbuds monitor attention and emotional stress, including anxiety, ADHD, burnout. Acoustic patches can listen for signs of pneumonia or heart failure, or electrodes woven into fabric can allow shirts to monitor breathing, heart rhythms, and fluid retention. Tissue sensing sensors can track intracranial pressure, and neurotransmitter sensors measure serotonin and dopamine in real time, adjusting psychiatric medication as your metabolism shifts. Intraocular sensors can monitor pressure to prevent glaucoma. But I guess what I'm most excited about, and I've worn glasses since I was in 3rd grade, so this is probably why. Personally, I'm most interested in integrating wearables into smart glasses. What I really want is a heads-up display that shows people's names, because, you know, I'm of that age, and I've never been good with names. But apparently we all have to get a lot more comfortable with facial recognition before I get to do that. But in the meantime, it would be great to get nudges and warnings right here that I can't ignore, right? Because maybe my phone beep is pretty good, but this would be even better. Glasses in constant contact with your eyes, your face, your skin can have their own sensors. Glasses have been patented that measure blood volume, heart rate, blood oxygen, and vascular stiffness optically. Glasses have been patented that can detect heart arrhythmias and measure EEG to track mindfulness and stress. They can track what we look at, how we move, how we chew and swallow, and the temperature of our skin. But to pull it all together, wearable technologies are feeding into the creation of personal digital twins. Continuous, data-rich simulations of our bodies and behaviors that evolve alongside of us. Our digital exhaust, the data traces that we leave behind already from our behavior, already allow platforms and marketers to predict what we want with unnerving precision. Smart watches, rings, glasses, clothing, and implants will add streams of physiological, behavioral, and environmental data into these digital models. As machine learning fuses these signals with medical records, genomic profiles, family histories, social determinants of health, our digital twins will become predictive companions. Every heartbeat we record will feed a parallel life in data. Projects like the EU's DigiPredict consortium already integrate biosensor data into living simulations that forecast disease progression and trigger early interventions. Yet digital twins are more than just diagnostic assistants. They are extensions of our own agency. Each wearable that we configure delegates part of our self-management to code. Over time, machine learning combining biometric data with all these other facts will not only predict disease, but also our likely futures. 5 minutes to 50 years. Imagine a digital twin that recognizes your blood sugar is dropping before soccer practice, and based on your learned physiology and your daily calendar, nudges you to eat 300 more carbohydrate calories now, not later. In experiments where people meet their older simulated selves, Finland, the Finnish Health Service is experimenting with this, creating out of the data that's been accumulated by the state, Finnish state, a digital twin that they can have a conversation with about post-retirement planning. When they meet these older simulated selves, their encounters measurably improve preventive behavior. These twins give tangible form to the future self that we are shaping with our current behavior and empower self-empathy, a willingness to make sacrifices for our future gains. Cory Doctorow, one of my favorite writers, has popularized the term adversarial interoperability, which is when consumers have the right to use someone else's tools with something that you own that was designed to use its own bits. For instance, having the right to buy stuff in an Amazon app, even if you're on your Apple or Android phone. That's adversarial interoperability. By contrast, big tech's walled gardens keep users loyal by locking their data inside proprietary clouds. The European Union now mandates that electronic health data, including data from consumer wearables, be portable and interoperable, allowing citizens to download and share their own records. The principle of data mobility is a bulwark against monopoly capture. Ideally, consumer app data would be standardized and uploadable into electronic health records that can play with all of our toys. That would be full adversarial interoperability, closing the loop between self-tracking and clinical care. Google's Open mHealth initiative has begun integrating Fitbit data into the Google, which they bought, of course, into the Google Health Cloud, promising APIs for hospital systems and for AI analysis. But for now, data flow remains one way, downloadable, not shareable. True interoperability would not only improve transparency and research, but also democratize medicine, allowing patients to carry their histories across systems, platforms, and throughout their lives. The right to move one's data is the digital twin of bodily autonomy. Without it, our quantified selves remain imprisoned in corporate silos, and our health futures controlled by platforms rather than by us. While consumer, workplace, and healthcare uses of wearable data are the most critical sites for self-measurement, as tools become more ubiquitous, we will see other institutions try to exploit their use. For instance, wearables promise to quantify student attention, engagement, and stress. Wristbands measure heart rate variability as a proxy for cognitive engagement. These tools could, in principle, personalize instruction, steering a student's AI tutor toward the right pace or challenge. By the way, the only place I've really seen implementing this seriously is the party schools of the Communist Party of China, which have apparently been experimenting with them to make sure that everyone's eyes are open and focused on Xi Jinping's thought, which I think is probably a useful intervention on their part because Xi Jinping thought would put me to sleep immediately. But these tools could, in principle, personalize instruction, steering a student's AI tutor toward the right pace or challenge. Augmented cognition dynamically uses neurofeedback from the student's focus to modulate the pace and the type of information of the tutoring system is presenting to them. The sensors also provide feedback on the teacher's performance, using unconscious student responses to evaluate pedagogical quality and to offer data-driven feedback on learning outcomes. Now, I can imagine that most of us would say, if we got a bad student feedback from their wearables, that it's like, well, they were really looking at their phones. So it was something on their phone. It wasn't me. They were paying attention to something else. Khan Academy's Khanmigo, which is a concept of having, for K through 12 education, having one AI that dynamically learns about your learning style over time and is able to track where you are in the learning goals over time, I think this is a fantastic goal. And if this were to be integrated with some of these tools, it would learn that much more about students and how they learn and what kinds of motivations to give them in order to increase their learning. The challenge, I think, is to build systems that teach mindfulness rather than just metrics. That we want this to be integrated into education in a way that doesn't just turn teaching into your biometric feedback. By the way, the only religion that I know of that uses these, I would have included this, but is Scientology, which has always relied on the measurement of a galvanic skin responses to see how much progress you're making spiritually with them. But hopefully in the future, I'll be able to add a religion slide to this. Finally, while consumers, patients, workers, and students all have some rights to control their bodies and data, people in the criminal justice system have fewer. The ankle monitor has become a cornerstone of community corrections. Sensors track location, movement, even physiology to enforce curfews, parole conditions, and immigration detention. For DUI offenses, the secure continuous remote alcohol monitor, the SCRAM device, continuously analyzes alcohol in sweat and transmits violations to the authorities. The Trump administration has expanded ankle monitor use to 180,000 immigrants under ICE's Alternatives to Detention program. Some prisons are testing wearable trackers that monitor heart rate and stress to predict violent incidents in a prison or in a jail, a biometric minority report in embryo. Advocates argue that these parolee and prisoner monitoring tools reduce recidivism and overcrowding, make incarceration safer, and are cheap. Critics see them as an Orwellian trend towards social control by the carceral state. Each upgrade from GPS to biometrics to predictive analytics increases the risk of their use by authoritarian regimes. The same wearables marketed for wellness will likely be used somewhere as instruments for coercion, repurposed for control. A society getting wired for wellness must ensure that it is not also being wired for obedience. Socrates claimed that the unexamined life is not worth living, and self-quantification tries to make self-examination automatic. For most people, wearable self-tracking is mildly beneficial, providing minor improvements in sleep, diet, or exercise. Although their use is contraindicated for those prone to obsession and dysmorphia, the much bigger problem than obsession is that people just learn to ignore them. Self-monitoring quickly reveals our weakness of will and self-delusion. Based on my own personal food diaries, for instance, I would have starved years ago. When integrated into chronic care, workplaces, and schools, the behavioral effects of wearable monitoring are magnified, but at the cost of autonomy and privacy. Ideally, our digital twins will mature into internalized guides, like benevolent superegos, a good angel on our shoulder, urging moderation and nudging us to achieve our goals. Used wisely, they can be moral enhancement technologies. Already marketed to combat sloth and gluttony, wearables also illuminate subtler attachments to alcohol, distraction, and stress. The danger of quantification is not, in my opinion, that it alienates us from some prenumerate oneness with our bodies. The bigger problem is that self-tracking reinforces the view that our health problems are caused solely by our own bodies and behaviors, rather than by structural and environmental factors. Did you walk enough? Did you meditate today? By focusing on individual responsibility, wearables obscure the structural determinants of health: pollution, poverty, patriarchy, racism. Yet wearable devices also illuminate broader social issues when used collectively. Fitness trackers paired with air quality monitors have shown surges in particulate matter raise heart rate variability and cardiovascular stress. Body temperature sensors on construction and warehouse workers have documented the toll of heat, and firefighters have documented the toll of heat and dehydration linking productivity loss to inadequate shade and rest. Sleep and stress monitors worn by shift workers demonstrate that fatigue and burnout stem less from personal failure than from scheduling policies. And in these uses, wearables become instruments of solidarity and data for public health, not just tools for self-improvement. When self-tracking reveals injustice rather than merely counting steps, it serves that higher purpose, turning the quantified self into a quantified society where numbers reveal hidden facts that we are able to change. The challenge before us as we wire ourselves for wellness is to ensure that the examined life remains a free one. The benefits of self-quantification are real, but so are the risks of coercion and bias and algorithmic control. Ultimately, the friction point is not the sensor itself, but the data flow. The vast majority of consumer health data is unprotected by the regulatory gaze. If your wearable data isn't connected to a HIPAA-covered entity, consumer privacy law is often too weak to protect you, much less to ensure the interoperability of your data. We must move beyond the fragmented state rules and vague consent forms. We need federal data standards that grant every citizen the right to portability, to download and share their own biometric history, or lock it down entirely. Data regulation closer to the European standard is the only way to transform the digital twin from a corporate asset into an extension of our personal digital agency. By mandating transparency, auditing for bias in clinical algorithms, and rebuilding the regulatory oversight of agencies like the FDA, we can ensure that these technologies serve the public interest, not just top-down surveillance. We need more legislation like the bipartisan My Body, My Data bill, which protects the privacy of reproductive health data so that women are not incriminated by their phones when seeking abortions out of state. In that future, we are not passive data points, but active participants in shaping our digital bodies, using sensors not to be watched, but to watch ourselves and to build healthier, freer, and more accountable societies. Thank you so much.
Wow. My heart rate is variable.
Good.
More on the fast side, I would say. Thanks for those really tremendous remarks, and what a way to start. Research, education, data, privacy, so much more. We have plenty of time now for questions and answers. I'll just make 2 quick remarks and turn it back to you, which is those of you in the room, please use the microphone that's at your seat. You'll push the button to turn it on and push the button also to turn it off. Those who are online, please send in your questions via the chat. My colleague Ahmed Al-Azmar will be monitoring that, and we'll pass questions from the online audience into us to ask as well. So I'm going to open it up for questions to start. There are no such questions. While everyone is thinking, I'll ask the first one. Or Matt, do you have a question?
Sure. Well, I can do a quick one. Thank you, first of all. It was a tour de force, and I am going to need to listen to the recording to catch all that you talked about. Thank you. My quick question is, there was a point in one of the slides where you said HIPAA is not yet applied to these sort of commercial self-monitoring devices. Does that imply that you think HIPAA ought to be per se extended into this domain, or were you thinking more along the lines of the My Body, My Data? Like what exactly kind of regulation are you thinking about?
I think the direction that I was talking about of making these compatible with electronic health records, then that would up the ante to make sure that it does fall under HIPAA. But I don't have a strong opinion about whether HIPAA needs to do it or should be shoehorned into HIPAA. It may need new legislation, as you said. Do you have a feeling about that?
I think if it goes into the electronic medical record, obviously it becomes covered by HIPAA. But the challenge I see in terms of regulating all of this is where do you draw the line, right? Because there are so many ways, as you alluded to right at the beginning of your talk, there are ways in which people have been monitoring their own health for generations. And, you know, at what point does that become a collected, you know, a set of data that needs protection versus it's just something I have in my diary?
Yeah, an electronic diary for keeping track of your period, should that be?
One question I would have in follow up is, who do you feel like is driving this agenda? You know, the idea of integrating into EHRs would suggest it's more in the medical, could be more in the medical side, but the tech companies are involved. There's so much, almost overwhelming the number of these wearables and devices. Do you have a sense of what's driving?
Well, most of the wearable use is driven by the desire to improve your body. So I think there's just an understandable interest. I just reposted today, someone at the New York Marathon was holding a sign that said, "This is too much work, try Ozempic." And, it may be that we're at the point where Ozempic and other drugs take over from some of the anxieties that we've had about obesity. But I think self-monitoring has mostly been for that on the consumer side. But as I started, I do think that there's very strong incentives for the health system as a whole, whether every system sees it that way financially. If your hospitals are a bigger part of your business, then you're probably not. But if you also own a VNA, then you might say, let's do VNA instead of a hospital. And I think that is a strong pressure as well. But besides that, yeah, I'm worried about the other pressures, the criminal justice monitoring and the other.
Sorry, I'm behind you. I'm wondering how you distinguish when some of these apps become health or wellness, or other devices become health and wellness. Many of the examples you gave started in non-health and wellness applications. They started as, workplace enhancers, it then became occupational health, or they started as sleep enhancers, it then became sleep medicine. And does it matter whether we're thinking about them as wellness or health, or whether we're thinking about them in some other context in terms of how we think about the regulatory scheme and the way we do research with them? I'm just thinking about it for the first time now, so I don't have a strong opinion yet either.
And you not dropping dead. Also interested in not dropping. Have a commonality of it. If we come out of it. I think that the design implications might. I think there's some different motivations. Oh, yeah.
Make sure you stay close for the online participants. Sorry.
So my question is, it's piggybacking on the previous one. So if our Fitbit data that tells me I've made my 12,000 steps today gets uploaded to my electronic medical record, does anybody care that it gets uploaded to my electronic medical record? My provider who I work with, or not mine, but I work with many, are run off their feet. They don't have time to look at it. And then you might say, if I'm uploading my data and they didn't see something that was indicative of an undiagnosed illness and I drop dead, and then somebody sees of my family that, oh, well, all that information was there. How come nobody was monitoring it? There's a lot of things in that question, but if we upload it to who cares about it, who's going to look at it, who's going to monitor it? I'm not a healthcare provider. I don't know if something that I'm wearing is monitoring something that may end up being detrimental to my health. So, who's responsible, I guess, for all the data and what it shows?
Attempts to create clinician simulacra, to take out the image of your doctor and their communication styles and to make your clinical chatbot act like the doctor, and how much more complicated something like malpractice would be in that situation. If that bot makes a mistake and it has your face and your language and talks like you. So yes, I think that is, you won't be surprised that I, as a techno-optimist, think that algorithms eventually will catch up here and that we will be able to define the conditions that should create alerts, as I was talking about, that this person should be notified if this happens and that person should be notified if that. But there's a lot of gray areas here. The medication compliance thing is when I have a 97-year-old mother-in-law. She has good care at this point. But if she had a robot in her house and she refused to take her meds, I think about that situation because she's got compromised cognition, but she's still pretty there. And it's like, I don't want everything to be called in, but so I do think about that situation. And senior care, the advantage of home monitoring in senior care is huge as well. I think one of my slides showed that as well. But yeah, I think there is a huge issue with liability here that has been unsolved so far.
So, can you say anything about what efforts are being made to coordinate between wearables, cloud storage, middleware, and search, such as Google, to make the data capture useful to, for example, an intending ER physician? And does this need to be regulated?
Well, if an attending ER is going to be looking at it, yeah, it needs to be regulated. Yeah, I mean, that would be what we were talking about earlier, the integration into electronic health records and medical supervision. Say it again.
What efforts are being made to coordinate between wearables, cloud storage, search?
So again, this is not a topic I'm as deep in as I would like to be, but so far as I understand it, Google is probably doing the leading effort here. The Google mHealth integration, the attempt to create status standard that would be, you'd be able to connect other devices, other systems to as an API, and also an AI system that would be able to detect things and flag them and do something about them. So I think Google's probably the leader in this case, but I imagine that every major healthcare company has some kind of project along these lines, and that we'll find out soon.
You mentioned a little bit about this idea of alienation from yourself, but I guess do you ever worry or have concerns for alienation from healthcare systems in settings where all of this data is now in the hands of a customer who can then use it how they want or promote a certain agenda or belief system?
We're already seeing that, aren't we? I mean, I started going into my clinician 25, 30 years ago with printouts and saying, you know, look, I want metformin right now. And he was unmoved often by my my search, my self-search. But people are doing that now. They're taking their medical records and uploading them into ChatGPT and asking what they've got. And they're getting a differential diagnosis that includes, you know, brain tumors. And then they have to go and talk to their doctor about that. And I don't see a way around this. I mean, don't we want people to be that inquisitive and to try to be learning about their own health conditions? It'd be nice if ChatGPT was sophisticated enough to say, if you're worried about the brain tumor, the 1% differential in the brain tumor, do not worry about that yet because for X, Y, and Z reasons. That would be very useful, but that requires a higher level of kind of digital coaching and agency on the part of the system. But yeah, I think we're already there. People are already doing that. I don't know if I wouldn't call it necessarily alienation from the healthcare system. We did a study back in the 90s at the McLean Center of, or maybe I'm pulling a Reagan here and confusing something I read with something we did. But at any rate, I know that it has been done, that they've looked at the effects of the doctor on the doctor-patient relationship and on patient compliance of having an argument with your doctor. And the patients who never argued with their doctor, who never had any kind of difficult communication with the doctor, were the ones who were the least compliant, and the ones who argued with their doctors were the most compliant. So it may in fact be going in and saying, why don't you think I need metformin? Convince me that I don't need metformin. That's the patient you want, right? So I don't know that alienation is the right word.
There's another set of medical devices that are also communicating that patients and people don't necessarily know that they're being monitored in those ways, that has implications on access and payment. If you have a CPAP machine that's communicating electronically to your doctor and also to the insurance company who decides whether you get that kind of, and you don't have a choice when you get that CPAP machine. If you wear a prosthetic knee that has a computer associated to it, that communicates your steps and your gaits and your ability to fall. And that insurance company is going to decide which CPAP machine or knee that you're qualified for based on their criteria, not based on your outcome criteria. So I think there's another level of concern that I have around the ethics around these communicating data, not necessarily wearables of choice, but wearables that are not linked by the traditional sense of choice.
What do you think what would be a scenario where that would be a bad situation that you're
Insurance company decides that you don't need a knee that actually helps prove that you are going to fall less. If you have a computer,
the knee is telling them you're not using it as much as you should.
You don't take enough steps for their criteria. And yet what we know is that people that have a low number of step counts that use a prosthetic knee, which are what they are going to judge you on, are more likely to fall. And so if you're a household ambulator and you are not taking as many steps, they're going to say you don't require that. But in the reality, a person that's a difficult household ambulator will fall less and therefore have less head injuries, less hospitalizations, less breakage of hips. So they may use different criteria based on not paying for devices rather than paying for the outcome of who falls less.
So my wife is kind of the authoritarian monitor of all of our medications in our family. And she always gets really mad if we don't fill our prescriptions on time. She says, then they're going to know that you didn't really need it, that you weren't using it all. So you have to go and fill it exactly at the moment that it's due. And I was like, yeah, that's true. Am I worried that that is some kind of it's an inescapable self. In the case of monitoring, like with cardiac pacemakers or something, the fact that more eyes are on what's happening with that device doesn't necessarily freak me out. But I see what you're saying about the needs.
I don't have a problem with my doctor knowing that device. I do have a problem with a person that has a different motivation for my access to those devices that is inherently different than the healthcare outcome. They're looking at a financial outcome that is based on not paying for it as much.
And I think that's the big difference between when I was trying to parse that integrated healthcare systems in the United States can have fiscal motivations to do some of these things, as opposed to the more legitimate political and kind of pro-social motivations of a European healthcare system.
Criteria in Europe for a prosthetic knee that has a computer control is different than it is in the United States.
Exactly. Right. And there's less of a motivation to make sure that the payer is seeing it. It's more the clinician's response. Right. Exactly.
I'm really interested in what you're saying around like an intolerance for a perfect patient and how that could exacerbate injustice in medical systems. And I hear that's what you're saying. And I'm really excited about what you're saying as data as a tool for justice, and curious about creating incentives for that justice and regulatory systems that facilitate that justice. Because I think we can come up with a lot of scenarios where that injustice may occur. Like I can't help but think about insurance premiums and dynamic pricing and increased stratification because of that increased data collection, and how we could see exacerbated harm to communities who otherwise still cannot afford insurance based on that increased stratification collected by consumer or choice-based opt-in wearables. So yeah, really curious about your thoughts on regulating toward justice and continuing to create infrastructural systems beyond just regulating around data and privacy.
What you're just saying there, though, it's like, I think there are certain social problems where we could say, in the context of us not having universal healthcare, this kind of data or this kind of technology could be used in this way that we aren't comfortable with. But I rarely find that the problem is with the technology. It's with the not having universal healthcare, right? How do you feel about what you just said? Is it more the latter? Is it more that we don't have universal healthcare, and then in that context, some things are going to happen which we don't like?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think we have to think about regulation within the system we exist within, right? And the ways that technologies will be weaponized against consumers within the system we operate in right now, right? And obviously that's linked to the injustice of the absence of universal healthcare. But knowing that is the reality of most American consumers, you know, how do we protect American consumers in the meantime before we achieve universal healthcare?
So there is this kind of general question in technology ethics about techno fixes, making sure that we're not promoting techno fixes. And I assume that most of my critics think that I'm a techno fix promoter. You know, Ozempic to me seems like a techno fix. You know, it's pretty close. So on the other hand, you can get into a situation where it's like, okay, we want to prevent women from being battered by their husbands, so we'll give them a Fitbit that will detect if they have a fall that they can't get up from. And it's like, well, that's not the solution, right? That's clearly a techno fix of the wrong kind. And I think that there are a lot of things like that. I agree. But usually the solutions that I reach for are the systemic ones, right? What would it take for us to systemically address domestic abuse in a way that we're not just giving women Fitbits to fix it? So yeah, I think that that's a problem. And in terms of your prior question, how we can facilitate the data aggregation that would have these pro-social benefits? Well, again, if we had, you know, I was concerned about this when we adopted GINA back. I was at the McLean Center, maybe right before we adopted GINA, but the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Part of the debate around that was a debate about how legitimate it is to create aggregate genetic information data sets that could have all these tremendous and have had all these tremendous benefits. And it was one of the reasons why I was enthusiastic about 23andMe, which again is another cautionary tale. You give your data to somebody and then it goes bankrupt and they sell it to somebody else. Fortunately, I think it's okay in the case of 23andMe, but aggregated data like that is, I think, a pro-social benefit. And we need to create the regulatory regime that doesn't allow the 23andMe outcome, but does allow a more European, like Iceland created an agreement with Decode for every Icelander, there's only 250,000 of them or something, but every one of their genetic records got uploaded to this firm, and then they were trying to figure out what were the obesity markers, and et cetera, et cetera. I think that's great, and I don't think any Icelander has suffered as a consequence of that, but it has to have that kind of public scrutiny and transparency.
Thank you. Talking about technology, I'm challenged. But my question was, in the discussion about genetic science and all that, Ramona Corin, I'm a patient researcher. So my question is, how much is ethics involved in this research? How do you think the ethics will, translate to patients and that consideration, and the insurance and all that? How much do you think that will impact it?
This is a research ethics conference. I do think it's a very important observation that most patients in research don't understand the conditions of informed consent that they're being asked to consent to. And I'm not sure if there's a technological fix in there, if a chatbot could explain it to him better than a doctor could. Probably the chatbot would have more time to talk to them about it. But from my understanding, most patients, especially in extreme circumstances, are not that interested in all the differential and the benefits and the risks of complications. They're more interested in social, giving something back to society, or the small possibility that it could be benefit to them. So I think that's always been a huge problem in research ethics. But if there were a technological fix out of this, it'd be great. I'm worried that in a regime where we seem to be destroying all the regulatory agencies that are supposed to oversee these kinds of costs and harms to society, that we will also fall down on the research ethics side, on the patient ethics side. I don't think there's been an immediate impact so far, but I don't think that this regime has ever given two thoughts about protecting people from the costs of medical research. Except RFK, of course. He wants to protect everyone from medicine by not giving them any. So
let's thank Professor Hughes. Thank you. That was great.